That's probably better, yeah. Thanks for observing that. I've gone way off.
We'll talk about Lano tonight. Gradually, over the next 2 or 3 talks, the theme will come out. We'll have a sub-theme for tonight. This is not quite a chant, but a poetic kind of address to Lano. Lano rules what would be winter months for us, February through October, because at that time the clouds come from the direction of Tahiti and the rainy season begins. And in the rainy season there's much greater fertility, and so Lano is associated with the clouds and is associated with fertility, as we're going to see many times over.
Your bodies, O Lano, are in the heavens, a long cloud, a short cloud, a watchful cloud, an overlooking cloud. In the heavens it is. From Uli Uli, from Mele Mele, from Pola Pola, from Ha Echa E, from Oma Ke Ulu Ulu, from the land that gave birth to Lano. Behold, Lano places the stars that sailed resplendent through the heavens. High resplendent is the great image of Lano. The stem of Lano links our dynasties with Kahiki, has lifted them up, purified them in the ether of Lano. To give a few little asides there, Kahiki is the mythical island, which is something like Olympus was for the Greeks. At the top of the mountains it was for the Greeks, and Kahiki is a special island that is the source of all the gods. It's something we're going to go into in more detail in 2 or 3 meetings from now. And let's see. Again, he's associated with the clouds for certain, and with the heavens, and especially what in the Western terminology would be called the firmament, that is placing the stars in the heavens. Here's another part of a chant. Lano, the rolling thunder, the heaven that rumbles, the sea disturbed. Or Lano and Kea Kealani, together fructifying the earth, observing the tapu of women. Clouds bow down over the sea, the earthquake sounds within the earth, tumbling down there below Malama. So basically what the religion does is it relates nature situations and seasons and certain qualities of nature with different divinities. So it's clear then that Lano is associated with the heavens, and especially the stars and the clouds. It's also clear that Lano is associated with the ether and with lightning. And it's very, very clear in everything that is made mention of Lano is that fertility and dynasty, lineage are associated with Lano. Now, there is also a lot in these chants, in these addresses, in these poems that are sung to the gods that is not apparent. It's very difficult to get inside of the mythology of Hawaii. It's similar to being in a very bright sunlight and then coming into a dark, dim room. It takes a long time before things start coming out so that you can see them. And this is something I think that's valuable. It's a phenomenon that is necessary in entering into any culture, but especially one that is as obscure to us as Hawaiian culture is. But it is a phenomenon that is relative to a matter of great importance to us, Because if we're doing our spiritual exercises, we're trying to open up seership. We're trying to open up clairvoyance and see other worlds, which requires an accommodation that is much greater than the accommodation to a dimly lit room after having been in the sunshine. And so I want to take a little epicycle and look at that just for a few minutes. And that is the quality used in clairvoyance and in spiritual sight. They are each two different things. They are each a different thing. Clairvoyance is just the ability to see another realm, whereas spiritual sight is the ability to see another realm and have an intuitive insight within that seeing, so that there is a knowing or a full understanding. What I want to talk about is called the association of consciousness. And it means literally that. It means that if we learn how to do it, it is possible to associate our consciousness with another thing or with another being and exist in that other being as though we were it without loss of self. Now that's the important phrase, without the loss of self. We should be able to assimilate our consciousness into or associate our awareness with the awareness of another being without the loss of self. One can associate consciousness with something that is of a much lower awakeness than us, such as a plant. If that were the case, one would experience the dreamless sleep consciousness as it's described that a plant has, but much more than that. The constituent elements of the plant would be experienced almost the way we experience our own body, and the tutelary consciousness would be understood or felt if we associated our consciousness with a plant. This is actually the way, if you believe people, and I see no reason not to believe people, this is the way herbalism in all societies has begun. That people with sensitivity, controlled sensitivity, could put their consciousness into the plant and know its nature. And by understanding its divine correspondences, the doctrine of signatures, for example, of Paracelsus, they knew what it was associated with, and they could use it for healing. We all know that it happens inadvertently, that we can associate our consciousness with someone whose awareness or awakeness is the same as ours, other human beings. Something like a compassion, we can experience it as another person experiences. This is much more than mere mind reading. It's actually getting inside of the skin. It's even possible to associate our consciousness with a being whose awareness is greater than ours. This is what the Neoplatonists were so famous for. It's called theurgy, the ability to associate one's consciousness with a divine being and to be carried up into its existence. One can gain a lot from that kind of experience, but because one lives it as the divinity lives it does not mean that one understands it. That was the problem that the Neoplatonists, they described things, but they were not certain that they understood it all. There is a temptation to use another word instead of the association of consciousness, and that is to use the word identify. As in our slang term, I can identify with that. Well, identification is actually a perversion of the association of consciousness. Identification happens when one does not remain freely oneself and actually becomes partisan to the consciousness with which it is associating itself. In which case, sometimes people do this because they don't have a free life of their own in their own being, and they feel they can get it through someone else or something else, like a basketball star or a rock star or something like that. But if we give up our selfhood, those kinds of prejudices and sympathies and antipathies of the object of our attention become our own. Also, if we try to associate our consciousness with another being or with another object, and we are not completely doing it, but remaining reserved, that results in a judgmental kind of consciousness, where it's sort of like getting to know someone just enough so you can take shots at them, rather than really coming with full compassion. Okay, we can see these things happening in our everyday consciousness. I used to see it when I went to basketball games, that people got into the partisan quality of team spirit and gave up their own ability to judge the truth of something. And they actually hated the other team or hated the other fans. It's quite an interesting phenomenon. It's easy to see from this that the association of consciousness, if it can be done with beings of higher intelligence than our own, it's easy to see that one does not have to be highly intellectual to do this. Very simple people can do it, and they have sort of a dead reckoning. They have a direct knowing of the nature of something that comes by entering into things this way. In fact, intellect can even be an inhibitor to this kind of activity, because intellect is something that separates us. I'll come back to that a little bit later. 3 components are necessary for the association of consciousness to result in a new experience. And we'll talk only about the positive varieties of this. We won't talk about accidental clairvoyance or mediumship or channeling or any of those sorts of things. The first thing that is needed is a clear, unexcited, positive as a gear is positive, sensitivity and receptivity. We have to be able to be sensitive to something other than our own. If we isolate ourselves, or if we get too much into our own being, we harden our being. The second component is a very strong sense of self that cannot be swept away by whatever we put ourselves into. It's sort of like swimming. If you can be in some pretty nasty tides if you can maintain your own body. It's a moth, beautiful thing. Oh no, it's going to get the lights. And finally, the third element is the skill and ability to adapt the sense of self to the sensitivity, or to control or project the sensitivity. This triune balance of faculties or of abilities varies, and the consequences or the result of the variance leads to different kinds or degrees of consciousness. Probably the best is perfect balance. But in other ways, this is saying the same thing as there is a seer, a strong self, an object that is seen to which one is sensitive, and the controlled process of seeing. So this is a running joke that goes on here, which are the components that were talked of in the Surendama Sutra, which I recommended everybody read several years ago, and which I'm sure nobody has read yet. I think I might have to read it myself in order to encourage other people to to get to it. This goes on at least once a year. We jibe on this. All right. The whole reason that we're going into this epicycle, there are two reasons actually. One is because the times of second-hand spiritual experience, that is vicariously through a priest or a shaman or something like that, or through reading and studying the works of seers, those times are ending. And we are right on the threshold, right on the very lip of more direct, immediate spiritual experience. And the more that we understand very simple little principles and very simple little rules to apply to our consciousness, the better we will fare in what can be an extremely overwhelming situation. Some people scream when they begin to have clairvoyant experiences because there's just so much going on that it's a very common thing. I run into at least one or two people a year that think they're going insane because of the experiences they're beginning to have. The other reason is because we need this kind of consciousness to draw out the wisdom of something like a very foreign culture, such as Hawaiian culture. And it would be nice if cultures superseded each other in such a way that they incorporated everything of the previous cultures that had come before them, and that they could be relegated to some kind of historical scrap heap. But that isn't the case. Human beings, because we are not total and whole, because we are not balanced, and because we can only take things a little bit at a time rather than unfolding to a large unified understanding of things, societies develop special facets of the understanding of reality. And if we want to understand our own spirituality on our own quest, the more that we can glean out of something like Hawaiian mythology, the better it is. So what we're trying to do then is we're trying to associate our consciousness into Hawaiian culture. If we think about it, Hawaiian culture is different to us, but most of the other cultures we've looked at were pretty different also. Even we spent a lot of time on Greek mythology, and even the Greeks that came out with the myths were very different people from us. In early ancient Greece, there were even things like human sacrifice. There's always a temptation to, when we are in our own consciousness, to think it's always been like this. That's what the now feels like. It has that quality of eternity. Yeah, this is it. This is what it's like right now. I'm awake right now. And we tend to think, on one hand, that the consciousness and the way things were done by ancient peoples was just like right now. It isn't that way. They were quite different. There's also the temptation, because their outward ways were apparently more primitive, there's a tendency to look down on them when they were very capable in their own ways of having wondrous insights that we should not look down on just because we look at things in a different way. We look at things with modern material science. The culture of the Hawaiians was different because the Hawaiians were different people. not only different in being more primitive, and primitive doesn't mean bad, but especially because the Hawaiians were more oriented toward feeling. Probably the Hawaiian society was one of the more feelingful of all societies. This is evident in the language. The Hawaiian language, like almost all Pacific languages, even the Maori of New Zealand, their language is vowel-oriented. Vowels tend to carry the tone, the feel of the emotions, and especially the fluidity. If you have agglutinations of vowels, it's something like bird song. It just reeks with feeling. On the other hand, consonant-rich languages, because consonants stop things, are more like the thoughts that control feelings. So consonant-rich languages are languages of thinking people. A good example would be Russian. There's a very cold kind of controlling nature to that kind of consciousness. Emotion and thought are both vehicles of the spirit. They both have a concrete presence, a reality about them that we can experience, and that we can experience quite completely. Both mentation and emotion are tools. They're tools to bring us to act in the material reality in which our consciousness is now focused. Thought gives us a reason for doing something, or it gives us the curiosity to look into something. Feeling gives us the motivation to actually do it. Both are necessary tools, but both are potentially traps. We can get trapped if we like a tool too much. What we're going to say now for the next few minutes, Carl Jung would like very much because it's very dear to his kind of thinking. We can like a tool so much that we can identify with it, and identify with it as part of us, and there that word identification comes in again, which locks us into something. I've literally heard jazz musicians say, "You can sleep with my woman, but don't touch my axe." They had attached themselves to their instrument, and it was almost like a sacred totem to it, that they were so attached to it that they were not free. When a spirit attaches itself to one of its vehicles, we may prefer one over another, or we may like the workings of one over another, but if we actually attach ourselves to one mode of experience, we become locked into it and biased by it, and that process is called typification. We become a type. Relative to what we're speaking of now, our society versus Hawaiian society, we're looking at societies as thinking types versus feeling types. Not only does typification produce a bias toward a given kind of experience, a prejudice toward it, but it develops, just like any other identification process, sympathies and antipathies. such that feeling types often don't like thinking types. And thinking types don't like feeling types, and it gets to be, and you don't know why. It's not because of what is being said, but because of how it's being said. Usually, when we identify with something, we become deficient in something else. If we put everything into thinking, we become, in a way, malnutrient as far as feeling is concerned, and what we are ignoring and not living up to becomes strange to us, and we begin to fear it. And what we fear, we hate. And so we have sympathies and antipathies with different types. Now, if we have a preference or if we have a bias, doesn't mean a type. It's only when we become rigidly or habitually locked in one of our vehicles over another that we become typified. We should always remember we are spirit. We are foci of one spirit and not any of our vehicles. Any psychologist can tell you that the process of growing up and individuating stops once we get locked at a certain level of development. We see people who are what would be called sensate types, or even more so, people who think they are their physical bodies. Little children are, at a very early age. If a child gets an owie, its whole identity is challenged. Its whole being is challenged because that is its being is in the physical. So at anywhere along the line, we can get stuck in a function of our expression. Probably the ideal is to be thorough in all of the functions and to be balanced, or to be able to shift the balance according to necessity. So, we have a difficult time drawing out the meaning of Hawaiian mythology because we are not concentric in our consciousness, and we favor material things, and we favor material things looked at mentally, which is not the way the Hawaiians evaluated things. Thinking is a separating activity, an isolating and an individuating activity, and it tends toward objectivity. Feeling tends toward subjectivity and toward attracting and flowing together with others. One presents a thought. One does not share a thought in the same way one shares a feeling. When you share a feeling, sometimes even sitting in a movie theater, everybody feels the same feeling simultaneously, and it is carried away that way. I think this is one of the big attractions in sex for a lot of people. It's one of the few times that they feel the unity of feeling together with someone in a mutual experience. Objectivity and subjectivity are two complementary faces of a total experience. Both are valuable, but there is a tendency by identification again, or preference, to have them be exclusive of each other. So, we're not only looking with a cultural bias, we're looking at the product of emotional subjectivity, where in the moment one will come up with a variant on authority, on a story, or on a theme. I'm conjoining words together, trying too hard to concentrate, I guess. That Hawaiian mythology is so vexatious because there are so many variants. There were variants when we looked at Greek mythology, or when we looked at Hindu mythology, but not like there are in Hawaiian mythology. Almost every source has a number of different ways that the same story is told. So that's a little vexatious to us. We would like one, well, this is it. Everything that we've said, it should be pretty clear from the way it's said. We're trying to look at societies and why one society likes another or dislikes another. But everything that we're saying applies to individuals. Whether we like or dislike someone may not have anything at all to do with their moral values or their principles. It may have to do with their approach toward life. And that's very important. Now there's another factor in Hawaiian society that also tends toward having multiple ways of telling the same story and deviating from something constant. And that has to do with the peculiar circumstance of being isolated on islands far away from where large-scale cultures developed. The Hawaiians were illiterate. And they were illiterate at a time when illiteracy was anachronistic. Now that's that's a very strange thing. This means that they were not in sync. All of the ancient people from about 3,000 years ago back were illiterate, but they were in sync with the cosmological times to be illiterate. So we're going to look into, for a little while, classical, modern mysticism to try to get at the illiteracy of the Hawaiians and why it was out of sync and what the consequences were and what the consequences are. In our own life, we'll try to do all kinds of practical things. We'll go to a picture that we often go to. This is a horizon, only it is not the horizon that we see between heaven and earth, but it's the horizon between the transcendental and the phenomenal. Phenomenal is closed, it is limited. Well, I went right in the middle of that horizon, didn't I? Everything that is beyond this horizon is spirit, or more spiritual. Everything that is below it is more material. Everything that is beyond it is universal. Everything that is here is more concrete. All has beginnings and it has ends. We all have this in our consciousness, but it is very rare that we are purely in the transcendental mode. Things here in the spirit are very fluent, whereas things here are very definite, approaching being stopped altogether. The spirit is threefold. Our physical nature is fourfold. The physical, or all of the bodies were always associated with the square of the threefold attributes of the spirit with the triangle. The attributes of the spirit are willing, feeling, and thinking. Right here, at the center of our existence, we've always talked about it, is the lens of mind. What is called divine spirit wills things into existence. The light, love, wisdom quality of the life spirit is the pure imagination which imagines the possibility of things without being associated with any imaginations. The thinker The self, the ideator, forms universal ideas. They're almost concrete in that an idea has internal limits, whereas the love or the will to be of the Spirit have no limits. They are defined by unlimitation. However, the universal ideas are universal, but they have within them a structure, and a structure that has implied limitation. We have a concrete mind. We have an emotional or desire nature. When we use the word feeling, it's not the same as emotion or desire. We're talking about the feeling of pure universal love. We have a vital, active, etheric nature, and finally we have what science only knows about is we have a physical nature. We have this dense lump that we carry around that is astoundingly well developed. The miracle of the body is something that is very hard to overcome. I'm actually going to get to see a baby born maybe this next week. I'm on call from the hospital as soon as my friend who is a physician is having her first baby, and she knows I'm interested in all of those sorts of things. I've seen animals born, but I've never seen a human born. And I think she wants me there to get the exact moment of birth, but that's one of the things. So I get a chance to see that. So this is called the realm of divine spirit. This is called the realm of life spirit. And all of this is called the realm of the region of thought, which is abstract and concrete. And then we have the realm of desire. And then we have the physical realm, which is etheric on one hand. No, all right, a few letters missing. That's not bad. And chemical on the other. Okay, rough approximation of what mysticism, Eastern and Western, ancient and modern, say that we are spirit, and spirit is one and universal. But the focus of spirit, or the attention of spirit, has three attributes: the attribute of willing, the attribute of feeling, and the attribute of thinking. And we as spirit, in order to express and gain new experience, express creations out into the world, almost like experiments, and in concretizing our dreams, our creations, we gain the experience and expand our awareness and expand the development of reality itself. And the vehicles that we use are a mind. We have a reason for doing what we do. We have an emotional nature. We have a motivation, and we can feel the tone of things. We can be desirous of things or motivating to do things. And we have a vital nature that allows us to live, and in that living it allows us to move and to move things through our experience. And we also have this physical nature, which is the end of the line, which is the solid impact, where things that are very rare have been concretized to the point where we can see them outside of ourselves as separate objects, and from them learn the most rudimentary things of whether our conceptions of creation were true or not true. This is sort of the proving ground, and it's sort of like kindergarten, where we learn the basics of all things. So everything that we see around us has a life of some kind, even if it is just a energetic life, that is having to do with what physics would call energy. And behind that energy is a motive, a feeling, I don't know how you would say it, a mood for its out for and of its existence, and behind that is a reason, is a thought, is an understanding. And this, I think, mysticism does the best job of describing what a human being is, because behind all of that is the truth knower that can take all of these experiences and from them take new consciousness and process it into awakening consciousness. All right. Where did I got myself into? We, as humans, are in the transition stage from having been creatures, whereby we were brought through all different kinds of experiences, mineral-like, plant-like, animal-like experiences, creatures that were guided and led to the experiences that we needed, and we're now in transition to being divine, to being creators, where we ourselves participate in the creation and further the creative activity in our own right. In a way, we are gods. And so in that transition state, we have come down through a very long creature-like existence, passing into and out of these realms repeatedly in different conditions, so that our past history is so multifaceted that it's not surprising that we have all of the nuances of consciousness that we have from all the experience that we have gleaned. Currently, we are deeply involved in the dense physical material plane to about as deep as we can go. The physical plane is comprised of solids, liquids, I try to talk about deep and heavy things and I can't even spell. Gases, and then there are 4 ethers: chemical, life, light, reflecting. We don't worry about the names because different writers use different names, and sometimes the same writers use different names within their own writings according to what they're trying to get across. In this deep immersion in matter, we have come to know ourselves. In the whole process of involution, we have gone from being universal in our consciousness, one with everything, but with no concept of self, no ability to objectify even this universal experience. So through this grand evolution, we have been taken deeper and deeper into matter, and we have been separated more and more and more. In recent history, we've gone from racial consciousness to tribal consciousness to family consciousness until finally we turn inward and we are awakened to ourself. To be turned inward, to awaken on ourself, we had to be able to reflect on what ourself is, which is really an idea. The Buddhists are perfectly right in saying that self is nothing more than an idea. But since it's universal, it's eternal, it doesn't make any difference. Spirit is something more than an idea, though. But when we talk about a self or when we talk about a God, we're talking about an idea. The spirit that knows itself through that idea is quite another matter. I don't know that that can even be put into words. The ability to reflect on ourselves and to know ourselves means we had to be able to think. That is to say that many of those definitions that seem so simple are really quite profound. So when the ancients used to say that man is a thinking being or man is a rational being, they were saying something much more than that. Or when Descartes used his famous cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, therefore I think I am, he was doing much more than talking about thinking. He was talking about selfhood. This is another way of saying that in the process of thinking, of using our concrete mind, the more deeply we concentrate, this is where our deepest spiritual awareness comes from, the more deeply we concentrate our mind and utilize our mind, the more we are capable of transcending our consciousness to know who or what is doing the thinking. Now, this process of waking up to ourself and to our thinking is something that required a lot of separative experience, because so that in the process of visually seeing our bodies while closed off to everything else, visually seeing our bodies as separate, as that sinks in, that awakens the idea of self. So, the spirit, even though it's here just touching at the concrete mind, and it's one of those terrible pictures, it's almost like Siegfried in the opera, when he climbs to the mountain and sees Brunhilde, he kisses her, and in that one kiss, he's awakened to the wonder, he's awakened to awe, which in the opera is called fear. He didn't know fear before then, but it was, I think, awe would be a better word than fear. We say something is awful. Right now, the spirit begins to interpenetrate and come through all of our vehicles. In order for this to happen, like we had all these vehicles, animals are almost where we are. They have a physical body, they have an etheric body, they have an emotional body, and there's the hint of a mentality developing. But we have the ability to connect the spirit and come all the way through into the external world, and to take the external world and bring it all the way through to ourself. So previously we were something like the animals. We had these bodies running around, and we had a spirit that was not connected. It was a universal or a group type of spirit that guided the bodies indirectly. Did quite a good job. The spirits that guide the animals right now do a wonderful job. But it's not the same thing as being awake. Being awake is probably the greatest treasure that we have. So the mind had to be developed, the concrete mind, to know the I, to know the self. The concrete mind had to be developed, and this meant that all of the physical vehicles had to be developed in order to accommodate the mind and in order to accommodate the spirit. In the physical plane, this means that a nervous system, especially with a brain, had to be developed. However, in mysticism, it is claimed that the physical body floats in a matrix of the etheric vehicle. So an etheric brain had to be developed so that the relationship of the etheric realm to the concrete physical is very similar to that of the spirit the transcendent to the phenomenal, in that it's much more lively. The physical brain itself, while it is a wonderful tool, is not alive. The thinking that we do in the physical body is not the same thing as that we do in the etheric body, which is much more alive and much more awake. So we had to develop an etheric brain. So this meant we have a physical brain made out of solids, liquids, and gases, and interpenetrating it, we have an etheric brain. And that's what we're trying to talk about now. We'll eventually get to it. I thought there was going to be a lot of mysticism, very little mythology tonight. The etheric realm is a realm, basically, of life, of vitality, of energy. Moreover, it is a realm where the different ethers interpenetrate each other, just as the solids, liquids, and gases do, but the function or the functionality of the ethers is polarized. That means a different function is accomplished through each pole or through the compound action of the two poles. And the polarity of the etheric body is capable of asymmetry. That is, one pole can be activated more than another, or the poles can be activated alternatively, and such. The ethers function differently when they are incorporated into a vehicle, into a body. That is to say, the chemical ether, which works with attraction and repulsion, it closely approximates, but I don't want to make the statement that it is the same thing as electromagnetism, because electromagnetism, as it is understood by physics, is something that is in a deathly state. Everything we know about electromagnetism, we know by death. All the utilization of it is by death. We don't know the live, living chemical ether as a whole. But what causes the attractions and repulsions of atoms of chemistry are the polar effects working through the chemical ether. However, if the chemical ether is is incorporated into a body, the chemistry changes so that we have a whole new realm, the realm of organic chemistry, in which the elements still function the same but slightly differently. Everything happens at a different pace, and the structure of compounds is very different than it is in the physical realm. The material science is beginning, or has the potentiality of seeing the ethers as mystics see them, because if we look at the concept of a field, or if we look at the concept of light energy, which is seen both as a wave and as a particle, is coming closer to the view of mysticism. Materialism is rather gross. It is so focused on particles that it thinks wherever there isn't a particle that there is emptiness, that there is a vacuum. Mysticism is much more subtle. It certainly wouldn't deny that there are dense bundles, whether they're particles or not. That's a matter of question. It certainly wouldn't deny the existence of what would be called bundles or particle-like states, but it would say that if you can see more subtly, that there is a whole realm of life, and that what appear to be particles might very well be activities, something like vortices, complex vortices within an ocean of light. Within an ocean of life. And that things like attraction and repulsion might very well be the consequence of the way the organization of a vortex works, that it has a repellent quality. All right, I don't want to go into that. I'm afraid I might get way too much into something that's technical that would require a lot of explanation, so I'll start changing things. In any case, in the chemical ether, in a body, such as the body of a human being, when it is incorporated into a body, it's associated with the attraction in the assimilation of food or in the wasting. That is to say that whether a particle of food, because most of the food we eat we never use, whether it is used is a matter of the consciousness of the spirit indwelling that attracts the particle of food that it needs. And when something has outlived its usefulness, it is repulsed. The polarity works that way. Mystics have some really strange ideas about this. They claim that in an infant, for example, the negative pole is active before the positive pole is. And that is sort of like we make our way from the bottom up. That is to say that an infant is basically shit and snot for the first few weeks. That it's the ability to waste far exceeds the ability to assimilate and grow. The life ether, which works together in the biological process with the chemical ether, is also polar. It is associated with bringing the vitality, but its primary work is propagation. How did it say it? Propagation of life in biological forms in the material world as we know it occurs through cell growth, cell division. That the life has a field and something that it wants to do to express itself, and in order to accomplish that in the physical world by the process of attraction and repulsion, it causes cells to divide and it causes them to specialize according to the needs of the spirit. So at times the energy is first on the repulsion, which causes the division of the cell, and at times the focus is on the attraction when the two halves reconsolidate and each becomes an individual cell. The life ether, then the attractive qualities are associated with the propagation of life, and the positive pole is associated with the direction of that activity, especially the specialization. And again, the mystics have a funny claim that in childhood that the negative pole of the life ether is active before the positive pole, or more active than the positive pole, such that little children have all of the propagated round bodies, and even little boys look like little girls. And that the further along that the differentiation of the positive pole of the life ether occurs, the more specialization there is in cells, to the point where you get to the ultimate of propagation, where within the biased vital bodies of males and females, separate ova and sperm are produced, so that the process is almost specialized to the degree of externalization, so that the ovum is something that is viable outside of the organism and is not necessarily connected to the organism. The same thing with the sperm. All right, but anyway, you get what I'm trying to say, that the older we get until we have reached maturity, the more there is an assertion at the positive pole of the reflecting ether, of the light ether. The light ether is associated in the negative pole with sense perception and coloration. And at the positive pole, it is associated with stimulation of motion, especially with circulation and warming and such like that. That the function here is the two lower ethers are primarily biological, and when we start getting beyond the organism to things outside and beyond, we have the more intellectual ethers, and the polarization there is more toward receptivity from things outside and driving us toward motion toward them. And again, the same thing is claimed by mystics, that the negative pole is active in childhood way before the positive pole is highly active. That is, a child is highly perceptive from infancy on, but the ability, or much of the ability to locomotion, comes much further on. Eventually there is some kind of a balance, and again that differs from individual to individual. Finally, we're getting back to Hawaiian mythology and the reflecting ether. The reflecting ether is also bipolar. The reflecting ether is the vehicle of memory. Not the brain-mind kind of memory, but what would be called photographic memory, the breath record memory. Everything that has ever happened to us is impressed on the negative pole of the reflecting ether, so that if we learn how, we can call back every instance of our life, and we can see things that we didn't even see at the time. It is recorded so well. The positive pole of the reflecting ether is associated with thinking, or the propagation of thought within the etheric and physical body. All right. Now, again, the same claim is made by mystics, that the negative pole is active well before the positive pole. That is, children have very great memories before they can really ratiocinate. In fact, the ability to think is not really perfected until we get at least 40 years old. I didn't know how to think, I think, until that age. The powers of thought were very weak. Now, in the reflecting ether, things are loose. You know what I'm trying to say? It's not like a light switch where it's on or it's off, where it's at one pole or at the other pole. It can be more one way or more the other way, so that a person can be more focused in the reflecting ether, or a person can be in the negative pole of reflecting ether, or more in the positive pole. And there are actually personality types that are like this. There are people who are mnemonists, that you can read off to them 300 names, and they can tell you them back right in the same order. And they do it by visual picturing. There was in the late 60s, there was a very good autobiography of a mnemonist. And he was given a list of names, and then gave them right back. Just like that. It wasn't a matter that they had to call him up. He was asked how he did it. And he said, I did it like I was walking down a street. And on that street were mailboxes. And on each mailbox there was a name. And I saw them that way. However, because he was so focused in the negative pole of the reflecting ether. He was not well focused in the positive pole, such that his rational capacity, his ability to reason things out, was not strong. The same thing happens in the other direction. People who are highly rational are suspicious of the imagination. There are people that teach the physics of the brain on this university that have said that imagination is just so much noise in the brain, and that rational thought is where it is at. Eventually, when a person becomes very well developed and develops all of their divine propensities in their tools, one is both a mnemonist and a ratiocinative individual, that the two work together. But even there, the brain seems to be polarized in that the right hemisphere seems to be more sympathetic to the function of the negative pole of the reflecting ether, and the left hemisphere appears to be more associated with the positive pole of the reflecting ether. You can get into these realms quite interestingly. I find that if I take a nap at a time that I don't normally take a nap, suppose I were to be up and wide awake and intensely thinking about something, and then at about 11 o'clock in the morning to take a nap, you get into a twilight state, and in that twilight state you can get right into the reflecting ether, and you can see thoughts that you were having that you never brought into the brain at all, and they're just carrying out. Like they're just, almost like paranoiacs have. This is connected to this, connected to this. You can see them going on. And once I even got in that state, only once, and I blew it, and it's been, 30 years since that time. I laid in bed, and I was trying to learn music at the time, but I didn't know anything about music in the classical sense of knowing anything about music. But I got in that state, and I got a voice going. And then I got another voice going, and it was like there was like a fugue going, only they were more like English polyphony, not like using a canon where you reproduce the same melody line. And then I got a third one going, and I could do it all by thinking. And then I got so excited I blew it, and I've never been back there again. But you can see, Bach sat down at a harpsichord, and he composed on the spot a perpetual fugue. Amazing. It's in the musical offering that took place. Now, the same thing happens in societies or in the history of humanity. Before we became as rationally oriented as we are now, we were all of humanity. Several thousands of years ago, were much more focused in the negative pole of the reflecting ether. And in these times, without training, people could recite epics, like volumes worth of epics, verbatim, because that's what the times were. Because like a little child, humanity itself is growing, and in the way that the little child lives in its memories until it grows up and then lives in its thoughts, and it reflects on those memories, society was like that. Now, some people and some societies may choose the negative pole of the reflecting ether, whether it's in season or not. And Hawaii, being isolated from cultures where there was a lot of intellectual development, became mnemonistic, but at a time in cosmic evolution when access to the negative pole of the reflecting ether occurring naturally was fading. So the Hawaiians did not have a natural verbatim memory. They did memorize a lot of chants and a lot of movements so that they got them verbatim, but it was work. It wasn't something that came naturally. So again, we're seeing that the Hawaiian society is very, very different from our own society. And this talk is very different from the notes. So much so that I don't know where I'm going to be able to... So, not having a written language, they didn't have something that they could concretize a standard myth. They didn't have something that they could build an edifice of mytho-philosophical thought. So they were at a disadvantage there. And so there were a lot of variations. Now, we've mentioned before that the Hawaiians were emotional people, and being emotional people, they preferred subjectivity. Now, if we put the combination together of emotional subjectivity and Neimanism, we know what tricks the bias of emotion or feeling or desire can play with the memory. And there are all kinds of variations, some of which are nonsense and some of which are quite meaningful. This is not like a high myth where there are significant little details that seem like nonsense but are actually openings into some special meaning. This is something where there is stuff that is just purely emotional subjectivity. There are no classic Lano myths. There are Lano chants, and there are little stories, and there are Lano objects. Which brings us back to another theme that's going back and forth tonight. There's a really interesting peculiarity about our consciousness. The more in this plane that we focus on an object, because of the limitation of our senses and the limitation of perspective, the more subjective we become, the more we isolate our focus on an object. On the other hand, the more we put our attention into a subject, a general subject such as math or music or mysticism, the more objective we become. So then, the same is true for society as for an individual. That is, they were a subjective people, and they focused on objects. We are an objective people, and we focus on subjects. So Lano, as all of the gods of the Hawaiians, had objects. And the objects of Lano were the objects of extremity. Now, we're coming into something now that just utterly blows my mind. The similarity, despite all of the things that we've talked about, the presentation and the character of the people and the character of the society and the way the myths come, the universality of the spiritual truths that are in mythology between the Hawaiians or the Greeks or the Hindus or the Native Americans, it is astounding how much like it is, how much like ours it is. It may not seem like it, but what we're getting at now, and it'll become very clear from here on in, one of the themes that we're getting at tonight is that Lano represents the third member of Trinity in the Hawaiian society. The Christian missionaries, when they converted the Hawaiians, had no trouble at all, because all of the concepts that are in classicism and in Judeo-Christian tradition were already in Hawaiian mythology and quite well developed, so they had no trouble converting the people. In exchange for conversion, they took plenty of wealth from the people, but that's another sad thing. So, the third, the thinker, as we have said, is always the separative one, the initiator of the delineation into all of the specifics of concrete reality rather than the rounding or rolling into the universals of the spirit. So, the third member is always the separative one. Again, the life spirit and the divine spirit are completely universalizing, but it is the specializing that comes from the third. So, it is this specialization that results in the extremes. Two objects are the objects of Lano. One is the food gourd, the spherical food gourd, and the other is the Lano pole, a long pole sacred to Lano. So, we have the two extremes, the maximum of the expansion in all directions and the minimum in specialization, the extremes. Just looking at the Lano pole and the food gourd, we have the same as the third in Greek mythology. Remember Zeus with his Io, the masculine being associated with the feminine, and we have the sacred Phi. So the third is always associated with the father and mother coming together. It's just like the sphere of heavens having a handle on them, which brings us to our second reading tonight. Wowee! This is a reading, it's only parts of it, that have to do with the weaning of a male child. It's part of a chant, and the ceremony is gone through, and at about age 2, the child is weaned, and after that it has its association with the males of the village or the males of the tribe, and no longer does it live with the females. The chant runs like this. A lot of these chants, in fact, most of the chants are available in phonetic Hawaiian. It's like a regular translation. On one page is the phonetic Hawaiian, and the other page is the English. I actually sit and read. I spend a lot of time reading out the phonetic Hawaiian, and it's quite enchanting. This is the Lanu chant. My vine branch this, and this the fruit on my vine branch. Thick set with fruit are the shooting branches, a plantation of gourds. And a little further on, how many seeds from this gourd, pray, have been planted in the land cleared by fire, have been planted and flowered out in Hawaii. Planted is this seed, it grows, it leaps, it flowers, lo, it fruits, this gourd vine. The gourd is placed in position, a sharply rounded gourd it is, plucked is the gourd, it is cut open, the core within is cut up and emptied out. The gourd is this great world, it's cover the heavens of Kuakini. Thrust it into the netting, attach it to the rainbow for a handle. That's the Phi, attaching it to the rainbow for the handle, cutting it in half. The images are the same in Greek mythology as they are in Hawaiian mythology. It's harder to get them out of Hawaiian mythology, but they're all there. So, Lano, like Zeus or Jehovah, both of whom are the third, are gods of fertility. They're not the creator of the father. They're not the emotional facilitator of the mother, but they are the generator. They are like the Holy Spirit, like the Jehovah. Again, as we said earlier, the season of Llano is from October through February when the rains come. Llano was called the long god, and Llano was celebrated in a most interesting way. They cut a Llano pole every year during the season from October through February. And the Llano pole was from 10 to 15 inches in diameter. And the pole was stripped, and it was jointed at intervals. Unfortunately, they don't give the mathematics of where they jointed the pole. And at the end, they attached something like a bird made out of feathers. Again, the mythology here is fascinating, because clearly Shiv, as the third, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiv was the third in Indian mythology, and hundreds and hundreds of years before Bacchus's phallus was paraded at the Dionysia, Shiv's phallus was paraded all around India. And Dionysius was the son of Zeus, the representative, the direct representative of Zeus, and the direct representative of Llano was Laka. And so the Llano pole was sacred to both Llano and his human representative Laka, just as Dionysius was a human representative of Zeus. This also takes us right back to Wotan, who was the third in the Northern European mythology, who also sat on the top of a tree and had a bird on the top of it. And he also carried the winged caduceus that had the notches of the law in it. So the cross-correspondence between the mythologies, the universality of them, is something that's really, really quite amazing. So the Llano pole was carried from island to island between October and February. And it was always the same order of islands that it went to. I don't have that formula. I think the mythogeography of Hawaii would be very interesting, but I don't have it. When the pole came to an island, it always landed at the same spot, and the people carried it. And they carried it around the whole perimeter of the island, always turning to the right, meaning they went clockwise. Whereas in the uplands, there were people that were carrying a little dwarf god, and they were going counterclockwise. Sort of the dwarf god represented humanity, because we are descending. We are the creatures that are descending on Jacob's ladder, or the angels that are descending on the head of Jesus, whereas turning to the right is the way we rise in evolution rather than in involution when we become creators. Really very, very interesting the way it all works out. There were stopping places, and then they had feasts and festivals, and they had games that had been proclaimed by Llano, just like the Zeus-Heracles games were proclaimed. And they had mock battles, which sometimes became real with pillaging, and, of course, dancing. Sometimes there were sacrifices, sometimes they were brutal, and if there were sacrifices, the priest at the locale where it was, using the awa drink, had to swallow the eyeball of a sacrificial being. Again, the eyeball being this perfect sphere, being the focus of selfhood, being the focus of the spirit through the eye, the I amness of it. The swallowing of an eyeball was the internalizing of the internalization, or the vehicle of internalization. So even though it's a very brutal barbarian practice, it still had an esoteric meaning behind. People are getting the lessons no matter how rough and raw they may be. Eventually, Lano, when he leaves the world, was known as Lano the Loner. And they had a lot of, in all of the Polynesian mythology, canoes were sacred to them as vehicles, just as swords and horses were in the mythologies that we've looked at so far as vehicles. And the canoe, Lano set out on alone because, again, Lano is the individuator, which in the worlds that we call cosmos, but which to the spirit, where there is so much unity, the worlds that we call cosmos actually seem like chaos. And Lano was a sea. And we'll have a third reading. Well, it's a variant of the legend of Makahiki. Lano sends out two of his brothers as messengers to find him a wife on earth. They travel from island to island, and finally in Waiapio Valley of Hawaii, beside the falls of Hi'ilawe, they find the beautiful Ka'ikilani. Oh, this almost sound like those old Hawaiian, right? The beautiful Ka'ikilani. Yeah, there was a man that weighed about 700 pounds that died 2 years ago, and he was a Hawaiian crooner. And they had 2 specials on him on All Things Considered. They had interviewed him several years before, and then when he passed on, they played parts of the interview again, and they played some of his singing. And he sang in English, but he also put some Hawaiian in it, and it was really haunting. Like all 700 pounds of that man had feeling in it, and he could really carry the really misty kind of quality. They find the beautiful Ka'ikilani dwelling in a breadfruit grove companioned by birds. Lano descends on a rainbow and makes her his wife, and she becomes a goddess under the name of Kaliki Lani Ali Ai Puna. They live in Ka'ala Ke Auka and delight in the sport of surfing. The chief of the earth makes love to her, and Lano hears him singing a wooing song. He is angry and beats her to death. So that's strange logic that I'll never, ever understand. But not before she has assured him of her innocence and her love for him. Lano then institutes the Makahiki Games in her honor and travels about the island like a madman, challenging every man he meets to a wrestling match. Sounds like Heracles, doesn't he? As another son of Zeus. He builds a canoe such as mortal eyes have never seen, with a mast of ohia wood. I wonder whether the Lano pole itself was ohia wood. And a sail woven of ni'i hau, matting and cordage twisted from the coconuts of kia'u hau. The people bring heaps of provisions and pile them up before him. 40 men bear the canoe to the launching place, but Lano sails forth alone. His words of promise to the people are that he will return to them, same old theme again, not by canoe, but on an island shaded by trees, covered over by coconuts, swarming with fowl and swine. And all those other delightful things. I don't know. We don't want to necessarily dwell on going into the Rainbow Bridge, because we'll come back to it in a little bit again. It's going to be a rather long night. We're down to 2 pages of notes, and they're faster notes now. We'll skip going into the 40 days. think we've gone into that kind of thing before, and we don't want to do all of those little things. Most of all, of all of the things of Wano, the thing that he is most noted for is that he was the god of the dance. The devotees of Pele, the goddess associated with the Pele volcano, developed the hula more than any other people, but the hula belonged to Wano. Wano was its creator. Shiv, in the Hindu mythology, was also the god of the dance. In Christian mythology, Christian mysticism, Jehovah, the third, is associated with satellites, not planets with living life spirits within, but with satellites. And the moons in their orbits, because they're so swift relative to everything else, are the spinners and the weavers. Just look at the draw where the moon is from day to day, year to year, and you see a woven tapestry. In general, the first conceived and willed things into existence in darkness just through the will to create. In cosmic root substance, the Word aligned that which was to become atoms of different types. But the third, the spinner, the full hot, the forceful one, set everything spinning. So in Christian mysticism, the third is also the spinner, the dancer. In Greece, Dionysius, the son of Zeus the third, was the lord of the dance. So it is all very, very compatible with every other society. There were hulas for males and there were hulas for females. There were hulas that were done in secret only by kahunas, which is the name for the priests, who were something like priests and shamans and sorcerers all put together. Some hulas could only be learned from divine beings. Most of the hulas were sacred, but there were some that were profane and that were used for sexual enticement. The society was very much oriented toward hula, and I believe that is because it was very incarnating. The fact that they were choosing to be mnemonists in a time when the intellect should have been developed means that they needed a lot of incarnating. And if you are trying to take very subtle things of the spirit and put them into movements of the body, into gestures, into expressions, you have something that is extremely, extremely incarnating. Not only was it incarnating, but it was individualizing. Now, the ideal in hula was to make the movements perfect, almost as though you were a machine. The consequence of it was that individuals, being what they were, developed very stylized hula from little nuances. It's sort of like, if you're familiar with what calligraphy was in Japanese culture. In calligraphy, there were supposed to be perfect styles for each of the characters, but yet you could always tell who had painted what characters because their individuality came out. So at the same time, the uniformity of the spirit was developed, the individuality of the spirit was. The second thing about hula that was incarnating has to do, again, with a Lanu object, the eye. It took great concentration. Well, there's not that much for posterity anyway. That the concentration is actually in observation. It is reading something that is of abstract and spiritual value very much as one would read the clouds to see whether there was going to be rain or not. And that's quite an advanced thing. All right, to bring things back to a more contemplative level and a more inward level, we'll look at the last facet of Lanu, and that is Lanu as God of fertility. As God of fertility, Lanu was the god of dynasty. All of the gods had dynasties in Hawaii. And the dynasties were not only human dynasties, but they were divine dynasties. That is, from the basic trinity, each of the basic trinity and the male and female poles had strings of gods coming down from them, and then they also had strings of humans as part of their dynasty. Very, very interesting, very beautiful thing. A few years ago, when we looked at, nobody's left, Paul, you're the only one left, you and I. When we studied Hindu mythology and hierarchy, we went into the whole notion of patriarchs, which parallel the patriarchs in Judeo-Christian mythology. And we started with the first patriarch, Swayambhuv. We looked at dynasty then as there were individuals that represented stages of human development, and each of them was a patriarch. Now I want to look at it in a different way, and in order to do that, we'll do something a little different. We'll go back to a picture that we use from time to time. It's a very crummy, materialistic picture. But the Father, or the first attribute of Spirit, can be seen like a black box, like a storage battery. The second attribute of Spirit can be seen like a light bulb. So that the invisible power that you can feel in the jolt of electricity becomes effulgent and radious and luminous in the second attribute. We're not talking about light necessarily like a light bulb, but we're talking about lucid light, the light of subsistent spiritual consciousness. When that light is triangulated through the third, it gets broken down, and it gets broken down into the Lanu rainbow. The third is again a separator, and it separates into rays. So, in our development, the passage from the battery to the light bulb to the colors, and from the colors, reabsorption back into light and back into power, represents something as a formula in cosmological process, but it is also a formula for the religions that have been given to humanity to participate in the spiritual side of the cosmology in which we are experiencing physically. So there was a religion of the Father of which there are no traces. And there was a religion of the second member of the Trinity, which Paul hints at when he says that the coming religion of the second, which he associates with Christ, is like it was before when he talked about Melchizedek and an order of universal life and a universal light in which there was no death. But in between, or the third, is the transition. So things go from willing to feeling to thinking, and from thinking back to feeling back to willing. But the third is the transition, where things are given into the outer phenomenal world and then taken back into the spirit. So there are religions that have been present in the world now for a long time that are religions of the third or of the Holy Spirit. They are not singular as the religion of the second is, because all light is light, but they are multiple. But even in their multiplicity, they are usually associated like with the rays in septenaries. Since the third, the Holy Spirit, the Lanu, the Jehovah principle, is the Lord of generation, these religions are racial or ratio-cultural. You find very good examples in it if you read through Plato. Socrates in Conversations is always making cross-cultural religious references, saying, this is parallel in your religion to our religion here, and so your people have this thing where we have this thing. They exist so that specific flavors of experience can be brought to people. This is necessary because of our limitations. We can't learn everything at once. And the world in which we live now is excellent for learning special, separative, specific lessons. When we learn elementary lessons, we can gradually assimilate them and become total people. Something like a Leonardo, who was a scientist, an artist, a magician, a physically strong man that could bend horseshoes with his hands. When you have somebody that is total as a human being, that is somebody that doesn't need the specific kind of experience. The times we live in, because everything is so separate and variant, are excellent times for times of variety. So races or racial cultures are something like tools. Like spades do one thing and hoes do another, and sickles and rakes do other things. Each is for a specific purpose. All of the things in ratio or ratio cultural vehicles were taken care of and were different. If you think, for example, of the food of Spanish people versus the food of Germans. Spanish aren't keen on sauerbraten. Or if you think of the sound of the language of Hawaiian versus the sound of language of Indonesia, for example, as in the Ramayana monkey chant. Clothing is very different in each society. Music is very different, and especially the languages. But the strongest of all of these things was genetic. Not as strong as a species, but not as weak as a mongrel. So hence, in order to keep people within the genetic vehicle so that they could be brought the specific lessons that they needed, the concept of dynasty was established. And so all of these religions were sacred to the third, whether it's Lano or whether it's Zeus. It is the whole idea of separation into specific flavors so that the whole rainbow is covered. Supposedly one has incarnations in vehicles of each of the different flavors at least several times. As we become more like Leonardo, and as we individuate, racial religions become passé, and we come to something that is much more unifying, where we as individuals can see that we belong to the same spirit and that the same light passes through all of the colors. When that takes place, then the racial consciousness is used to undo itself, as in racial fighting, or as we see in South Africa, the forbidden fruit principle, that there's something exotic and something that we're missing that we need to unite. The whole idea of dynasty, we look on even as England with its royal family, we look at it as being something absurd. And so we're outgrowing that. Eventually, we will outgrow even what we now see as an ideal. But before we can come to this universal light, we have to know ourself. As long as we, here comes that word again, as long as we have to identify through a family, or through a race, or through a religion, we need that. We're dependent. But as long as we do that, we're in that same thing again of strife, of struggle, and of fighting, because there are sympathies and antipathies once we identify. We will not have peace until we come to ourself. We also don't need the special dynasty within a dynasty. In all of the ancient societies, even Hawaii is fairly modern, like pure Hawaiianism was existent 400 years ago. There were special people who had their own dynasties, and they were the priestly caste, whether it was the Brahmins, or whether it was the Levites, or whether they were the children of Lanu Laka. They had the looseness of the physical to the etheric, and the people who were ready to become kahuna had to be born within a certain dynasty within the dynasty in order to be initiated into the mysteries. That is also passé. All we have to do is become ourselves completely individuated within the Spirit. So there is a dynasty of another type, and that is the dynasty of self. Instead of looking at the influences from without, like in the body or in the air that we breathe through speaking of a certain kind of language, or in the food that we eat, if we turn inward and find the Lanu within ourselves, it's sort of a tracing back our heritage in the same way we trace our experiences in the physical world back through the memories and the impressions and the thoughts and take them and absorb them right back into the Spirit. We're tracing back a hierarchy, we're tracing back a lineage, we're tracing back a dynasty in our own being, and the more we can do that, the sooner we become free and we recognize Lanu within ourselves. So the next time we will begin to talk about Ku and Hina, and the general theme of why I went into Hawaiian mythology will come out next time, and maybe we'll have a little hula. Everybody has dozens of questions. I got to get on Hila to get back here.